All right. Okay, so before I get to that, though, I'll just cover a couple things about frameworks in general. So the first is like what is a framework, right? So a framework is a set of general use code designed to be like sort of general so that it can be applied to a very specific use case. Okay, so that's like kind of how a framework works in general. And very specifically for web framework, it's a specific general code that's intended for use with the web, right? So what that means is that it provides specific functionality for you that needs to happen for all web applications. For instance, all web applications handle like HTTP requests and responses, right? So a lot of that code is reusable between one application and another. And so people have built out these frameworks so that you don't have to write all the details of that specific code to get that web application working, right? So basically it provides this template, this general structure for you to use to build your web application. So that allows for your design to happen a lot faster, right? Because you don't have to write that specific code. And more likely, it's going to be a lot more robust if you use the framework as well, right? Because the people who have written the frameworks, they're expert developers, right? They're very good at what they do, and also it's like usually a team of like expert developers who develop these frameworks, right? So they've been working together. They work to make things a lot more optimized, a lot more efficient. They've accounted for like a lot of security issues potentially, and have all built that all into the framework so that you don't have to quite worry about it quite as much, right? And then in addition to that, if there's a big community around it, right, well, so many people are using it that there's like a lot of testing going on for, right? So if there are any problems, it surfaces, it gets fixed for the framework in general, and by you just like updating to a newer version of the framework, right, you have those fixes in place. So that's basically why we use it. Let's see. So typically a web framework will provide routing for you. Okay, so you'll understand what these pieces mean a little bit more as I go through that flow. But routing is basically just directing when you get a URL which specific piece of code runs in your framework. Okay, so that's what routing does. It builds your request and response objects for you. So usually when you have an HTTP request, right, or response, you have like all these different like sort of settings, like in terms like such like the headers, which include like the encoding type and all this kind of stuff, right? But that stuff is usually pretty consistent, and especially if you're just navigating between different pages of your single web application, you don't generally need to worry about setting those things, right? There's only a few different things that change between each request and response cycle. So by using a framework, you don't have to write out all those things, right? It'll just take care of those kind of more generic details for you. In addition to that, it provides a consistent file structure depending on the framework. Okay, so Flask is a mini framework. It provides less of that structure. When we move to Django, we'll be providing more of that structure. But by having this consistent file structure, when you're working with other developers, they also will know sort of where your pieces of code are going to be. It'll be easier for you to develop on top of what other people have developed as well.
So like if you were using someone else that's writing the same code, their pathway would be the same as yours, so it just...
Exactly, yeah. So that way, like if you say you were working on a new project, right, and you know that you need to update a specific feature, you will know, roughly where in the file path you should go to find the feature. You don't have to like go read through all of the code, right? So because it's consistent in that way and people follow these same conventions, it just makes developing a lot smoother, basically. And again, there's the degree of structure depends on the framework, right? So Flask is going to have less of that structure, but on the other hand, it's simpler and easier to understand, whereas something like Django will have more of that structure, provide more functionality for you, so you have less code you need to write, and it's also more robust, but at the same time, it's more complicated, there's more moving pieces, you have to know sort of which piece to tie into when you're using it. So we're going to be starting with Flask because it's very easy to get up and running, because it's simpler, and it's also easier to like sort of learn from, right? Because you understand each of those pieces because there's less files that have already been provided for you. It's also just really good framework for writing like really simple small projects. All right, so there's also this concept of a library versus a framework. Okay, so both a library and a framework provide a lot of reusable code for you. So it's important to understand sort of what the difference is sometimes. The way that I like to think about it is that you will call a library, and a library will call you. Okay, so what I mean by that is you write a piece of code, right? With a library, your code will call another method within the library. That library then does some calculations, does whatever it needs to do, and it sends a response back to you, right? But the piece of code that's sort of in control is the code that you're writing, okay? With the framework, because it's providing this overall general structure, right? When the new HTTP request comes in, the request actually hits the framework, not your code, right? After it hits the framework will eventually direct it to your code, right? Which is why we say the framework calls you, the framework calls your code. And then after your code does some things, it'll send a response back to the framework, and the framework then sends that final response back to the client. Okay, so it's just kind of a difference in sort of how it's organized a little bit. Both provide a lot of functionality, both are very useful, and both are kind of like can be combined with each other, right? You may import a library within your framework to do specific calculations or something like that. Any questions on what I've covered so far?
Wait, where's the framework
So
directly?
for the library,
Where's the, you said that the library, like, you call it and then it calls you back, but you're mentioning that when you make a request to the framework, then where does that go?
So when a browser, right, like not you, but like the client makes a request to the framework will then call like your piece of code. Okay, so you could diagram it out a little. I'm gonna get a marker. The one over there? No?
basically
Generally, it's simple framework first, and the framework will
then it runs your code. Then
Then
it sends
call
a
it.
modified
So your
version
code will be secondary to the framework.
of the frame, like your framework.
You know how like when you write something like submit a makes a request.
Okay, so if this is like your code,
And then the framework.
right? If this is your code, and this is like the library code, right? Usually you have some method in place, right? That you like say like define my method, and then you have some line of code that says like library method of maybe some parameter equals like x or something. Okay, so you're just trying to get some information back from like the library. Basically, you're using this code to do some calculations, or maybe this ties to something else, or whatever it is, right? You're basically just trying to get information back. But this is like the one that's like initially running, right? This is the one that you sort of kick off. Okay, so the difference between this and a framework is that you might structure a framework more like, this is your code. And then like the framework is almost like it encompasses your code. Okay, so this is the framework. Okay, so when a new HTTP request comes in, right, the HTTP request, okay, it basically hits like the framework code. Okay, so the framework code, then it's gonna like sort the request, decide what to do with it, and then after it decides what to do with it, then it's going to like pass something to your code. Your code's gonna like do whatever it needs to do, and then it's going to basically pass something back to the framework. So it's like from here, up to here to here, and the framework will actually send back the final response to the code.
So basically, the framework could have modifiers for the HTML code. So then your HTML code gets put into that framework. Then the modifiers are put from your HTML code into the framework, and then it's like that modified version is what's being sent back out.
Yeah. So it is kind of like that, actually. Yeah, you write some code that would maybe say generate that HTML file according to what you want it to look like, with like some Python commands, and then the framework will do the conversion of making it into HTML, and also handle turning it into a response object to actually get passed to the browser. Figure out where to pass it to, which browser called it, what the URL is, how to reverse that, stuff like that. Whatever additional like content payload needs to be passed for that response. Does that kind of make sense? It's kind of a just small detail, but good to understand. All right, any other questions on what I've covered so far? Okay. All right, so the next thing I want to cover is virtual environments. Okay, so the virtual environment is basically a tool for keeping track of your different packages. When you're working on a web application, right, a lot of the time you need to use, say, a different version of Flask or a different version of Django. You may have built it using a specific version, right? You may also have grabbed some different libraries from different places. They may also have a specific version as well. Okay, so when you've built that all out, and as you're building it and you're testing it, everything's working great and working fine. Okay, but over time, these libraries will get updated. Okay, and they may change. The people who manage libraries may change how it works a little bit. So sometimes, and sometimes you have libraries that are dependent on like other libraries. Okay, so you quickly have like all these sort of other like sort of side applications, side programs that your application depends on. If one of those becomes a different version, or if for whatever reason one of those no longer supports your older version, right, your application could suddenly stop working, right, because you no longer have quite the right version, right piece that you're being tied into. Okay, so creating a virtual environment basically says that within this application, I'm going to use this environment, and my environment is basically this list of like, for this application, I'm going to use version 1.0.2.0.5, right? This one, I'm going to use 1.0.2.3.6, or whatever it is, right? You just list out all these different versions of the other application packages you're using so that you can consistently continue to use those. So that way, when you update your application, even if those versions like got updated, right, to like another version, you can still point to that old version that you already know still works, because that old version won't change on you. So, right, when it gets changed, the version gets upped. Okay, so having this virtual environment allows you to basically do that because it's a consistent environment, consistent state that has all of those different versions. Now, you may work on this one application, right? And let's say 3 years later, you're starting a new application. If you start a new application, that's a separate application, right? You could go back and use the old application's, dependencies, the old application's other packages, right? But since you're building a new one, it probably makes sense for you to just sort of start with whatever the newer, later version is. Okay, because it will have additional features. It may have some like security patches that have been put into place, and those developers have continued to, who manage these projects, have continued to develop the code such that it's more stable, more features, whatever it is, right? So then at that point, you'll probably take the latest version of Django or Flask, right? And then from there, it'll connect to whatever the latest versions of those packages are that still support what you need. And so if you were to just install all these applications on your computer, right, with all their different versions, you have to be able to quickly change from like one set of versions when you're working on one application to another set of versions when you're working on another application. So managing that transition is what the virtual environment does. Okay, so you have a virtual environment so that you know when you work on this application, I'm going to load this virtual environment, right, which has all of these packages tied to it. And then when I work on this application, I'm going to load this one, right? And so that way you know that you're not like breaking something because they updated one of the packages. And that's all that it basically is doing from a foundational standpoint.
And you can have multiple versions of, say, like that, like one of them like installed in your computer at the same time.
Yes.
And it's still running the thing that's called running on the boat.
Yes. Yeah. So what you're going to be doing when you start running Flask and also when you run Django is before you actually build your Flask application, you're going to create a virtual environment for Flask. You're going to install specific other libraries on top of it, whatever you want. Okay. And then every time before you start a Flask application, you're going to load that virtual environment. So you're basically going to load all those applications so they're all in place, and you're going to use those specific ones. Now, you can use the same virtual environment for multiple applications, right? And you guys are going to do that. You'll have one virtual environment for all your Flask applications and another virtual environment for all your Django applications. It's just that when after like some period of time, when like things start to get more out of date, you like 3 years from now, you still want this old virtual environment. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. A virtual environment also depends on the file structure. Okay. So for a virtual environment to know which packages it needs and which ones to point to, you create the virtual environment in a specific folder, and then it knows that it needs to go like up 2 levels of folders, then to that folder, and then like down 3 levels or whatever it is, right? So if you were to move your virtual environment folder, it's not going to be able to find the packages anymore. Okay, like you would have to sort of repoint it to the right places.
That's like when we installed Python or something yesterday. It said, do you want it in the normal location?
Right.
It's like, yes.
Yes, yeah. So you want to just make sure that after you create your virtual environment, you probably don't want to move it. Okay, so just be careful about creating it in the right place as they tell you to in the platform. And also, same with the packages, right? If you were to move the package, then the virtual environment would no longer be able to find it as well, unless you repoint it to the right place. Okay. And then, really brief note on file organization. This is what I recommend for file organization. Okay, and you don't have to follow this, but I do recommend that whatever file organization you use, you keep it fairly organized, and you don't have like files from different projects in the same folder. Okay, so the way I organize things is I organize them by which stack you're in. Okay, so I have like a Python coding dojo. Okay, and then I have another folder for sort of like which section it is. Okay, so I may have like O1 Python fundamentals, and like an O2 flask fundamentals. And then within like my O2 flask fundamentals, I'll have these specific assignments. So for instance, landing page assignment, which is one of the assignments we'll do today, as well as dojo server. Okay. So just make sure, 1, don't use spaces. Okay, it doesn't cause you problems when you're trying to traverse. And then 2, make sure that you keep a different folder for each of your assignments. Okay. When you make a Flask project, it will actually automatically makes a folder for you. I know it's true for Django. I'm not sure for Flask. Okay, but just make sure that at least you have one layer of a separate folder. If it makes a folder for you, then you don't need like one folder that only holds like one other folder. All right, so now to the most critical part, which is the flow of an application. Sure, I'm still recording. Okay. Okay. All right, so just like I showed you guys yesterday, right? We have this request, this client, and we have a server, right? And this client sends a request to the server. Okay. So what I want to expand on this is that this request, okay, it consists of three parts, okay? 3 parts that I would say it may include more than 3 parts, but these are the 3 most important parts, and the parts will be interfacing with. So the first one is the URL. The second one is the HTTP verb. Okay, and this can be either a GET request or a POST request, and I'll explain the difference a little bit. And then it can also contain content. Okay. This is only if it is a POST request. Okay. So for instance, you go to www.google.com, right? Your URL is google.com. And then the verb, if you're just going to the page, is going to be a GET, and we do not have the content. But that is enough to basically go to a specific web page. Okay, so when you have your web application launched, someone's going to basically type those things into their browser, and it's going to generate this request. Okay, and then from here, your server needs to decide what to do with this information. Okay, so this is kind of your inputs, right? I mean, all of your code in general, it kind of works like this, right? You have a you have an input or some sort of like trigger. And then that's going to call, some method, which may call like another method. And in between, it might crunch some data, it might store things in the database or whatever it is. And at some point, it's going to give a response, right? Which is your output. Okay, so in this case, our input is basically this request for this website. Okay, so after we get the request, in the server, it's going to first look at the route. Okay, so the route means it's going to look at what this specific URL is and what the HTTP verb is. Okay, using the URL and HTTP verb, the server will match against that route. It'll match that specific combination. Okay. And then it will point to a specific method. Okay. The method is going to look something like this. Define index. Okay. This will be like an example of a method. The route that it's going to look at, it might be something like slash and like get. Okay, so where this is the URL and this is the HTTP verb get. Okay, so using slash just basically means you're going to the home page, right? Like you're going to www.google.com versus google.com/something, right? Or like facebook.com/profile, facebook.com/login. You're just going to facebook.com. Okay, so you based on that, it will go to a specific method. Okay, you will have some code in here that does whatever it is. Maybe it's making a fetch to the database. Maybe it's just doing some calculations. Maybe it's storing some information, whatever it may be. Okay? You'll have some code in this method. And part of this right here was that previously when we drew this, we also had this other request to like the SQL database, right? We talked about how this is like a fridge and you can store data. This is not strictly necessary. Right? If you're not storing data or you're not fetching data from the database, you don't have to do this part. Okay, you can just make a request to the server can just respond to something. It doesn't always have to hit the database. Okay, so we'll talk about hitting the database in a little bit, but for today's stuff in Flask, we're just going to be making the request and then sending back a response without hitting the database. Okay, but if there was a database call, it would happen within these 3 lines. After this method is defined, it runs this code. You're going to return something. Okay, and your return is your output, right? So what you're going to return is you're going to render a template. Okay, this render template, this is your response. Okay, this is what is eventually sent back to the client. Okay, the difference is that because this is a template, we have something called a templating engine called Jinja. Okay? And what this does, this is actually this rendering template, this template is actually a combination of both HTML and Python. Okay. Now if you remember, our browser cannot read Python, right? The browser only reads HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we can't send this back to the browser because the browser won't know what to do. So what actually happens is even though you tell the framework you're going to render this template, this is where the framework comes into play, right? And the framework takes this HTML and Python and converts it to HTML. Okay, based on some specific Python code, it'll do whatever it needs to do, calculate things, build what that view is supposed to be, converts it into HTML, and then at this point, this becomes a response. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay, so this is that overall flow. Okay, so just make sure you understand this flow extremely well. You know everything in this flow. Okay, this will be true when you guys are doing Django. The location of the route will be different. How the route is structured will be different. How the syntax for how you return things will be different. And you're eventually going to have to figure out these 3 lines of code of reading like the database information and stuff. But this flow is always the same. It's the same in Rails too. Okay, so just make sure you understand this flow. This is the simplest version of the flow. Okay, there is some slightly more complicated version. One other thing that can happen is that we just covered what was the GET request, right? Okay, so this is simpler because it uses only the URL and HTTP. If someone is submitting a form, like let's say you are creating a new user on a page and you put in the user's name, email address, and whatever it is, right? You are actually going to create what's called a POST request. So basically, whenever you submit form data, you want to use a POST request. And whenever you are not submitting form data, you're going to want to use a GET request. Okay. GET request is basically just for displaying pages, just different views. POST request is when you need to process something. Okay. You can do a POST request without touching the database. Okay. Sometimes POST request and processing data is not like stored data, but it's still like you're still carrying like sensitive data. You will use a POST request for that. But a lot of the time when you're interfacing the database, when you're actually going to like create new entries in the database, you'll be using a POST request. If you're just getting information from the database, you'll be getting using a GET request. Okay, so we'll cover that again when we cover databases. So don't worry about that part too much. But just know that if you're basically sending data through like if the browser is sending data through like some form, you're using a POST. If it's not, you're using a GET request. The reason for that is that a POST, the way that they store information is a little differently. All the information in a GET request is stored in the URL, so anyone can see it, and so it's not secure. If it's in a POST, it can be more secure because they store it in the payload of how they structure that HTTP request a little differently. Okay, so you don't need to understand too much about the details of that, but just know that a POST is more secure, and that's why we do it for form stuff. Okay. So if you were to do a POST request, okay, in this example, when we hit the index, we just rendered the template, right? In a POST request, what usually happens is you hit another method. Okay, let's say we have a define create. Okay. This method will do some stuff. Maybe it hits the database, and then after it's done, it'll actually do what's called a redirect. Okay. In a redirect, you're not rendering a template directly back to the response. What you're actually doing is you're going to redirect and point to another URL. Okay, so it's saying like, when I'm done creating, I'm going to go back to this / path with the GET request. Okay, so you're actually telling the browser, okay, I'm done now. Now go to this URL. And then at this point, since you redirected to this one, it'll then do whatever code is in here, and then it'll render its template, and that's when you see the view. Okay, so this is kind of where you might have multiple methods before you get the response, or you might just have one. Right? It just depends on what you have set up. Okay, but the end part of rendering a template is always the same. Okay. Any questions on this? Does it all make sense? Okay. If not, we have the video. So. All right.